because of curiosity. I'm just riddled with anxiety. I'm the lowest level as a matter of fact.
Hey there.
Hey,
Why don't you introduce yourself?
hi, I am Naquan Ross. I am a relationship psychologist, and I pretty much do a lot of experimental designs and have a large focus on studying different aspects of couples or dyads or even individuals who are interested in understanding um, the natures and aspects of their own relationships. And specifically, I look at things like dating, emotional regulation, attachment. That's more of my area.
Yeah, we went to graduate school together for our masters, and I always thought you were a pretty clear thinker, so that's why I wanted to speak to you. So what have you was most interested you about exploring relationships, like psychologically?
Yeah, I think I've always had this. I think I've always had this draw to the dynamics of a relationship. I think specifically when it comes to non-platonic relationships, I find it interesting that people are essentially choosing someone to provide their time and energy with, a commitment of some sort, um, without much pretense. So I feel like when you have the family aspect, um, it's almost inherited. You know, you didn't necessarily choose your family. You're sort of born into that. So that is sort of a given. And then when it comes to friends, a lot of times that's, just naturally breeded through proximity and um, consistent social environments like school and sports, and things of that nature. Um, but then when you take it to the next step of a non-platonic engagement, um, it's almost like you're choosing someone more so than you would in any of those other areas I mentioned. And I find that interesting, the choice.
Yeah.
Why do we make those choices? Why did we choose this person and not someone else? What made this person more than a friend compared to not? Um, or what makes us choose to make this person part of our family? So I just find that very interesting. And I definitely think there's a huge science component of it that a lot of people have not explored enough yet. But there's definitely a community for it, definitely a psychology and scientific community for it. But I still don't think it's explored as widely as it possibly should.
Well, just set some context. Um, well, I mean, there is choosing, of course, in friendships. So you distinguish friendship from romantic, and are they different in kind, or is there like a continuum of closeness? And I'm never quite
Yes.
sure
Yeah.
myself what to say.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, because the research I did previously, while at Seton Hall, um, we sort of made that conjecture based on the results that we found. And I mean, the results was, there were many results, but, and I can talk more about that if you would like, but um, in general, one of the things that we noticed was that we wondered if um, relationship formation is almost a step-by-step process, that that you first start by forming this interpersonal bond, and then you next form this sort of romantic bond, and then you may form some sort of commitment. And there's degrees of going, back and forth or not reaching a certain level, um, uh, to an extent. But I'm not sure if that is as applicable as the other thing I'm about to mention, which is that I see the non-platonic bond as something that we are consciously or unconsciously choosing, even though we don't necessarily have all the information that we would need or want. It's almost like being very choosy, like in
Yeah.
particular. And I think and this is why we use the term a lot, preference, because pretty much you can technically be with almost anyone you want, and especially in this society. But we get choosy. We're choosy about it. We're particular about it. We want this particular person, or this person particularly wants us. And I think also in today's society, things are not as concrete and refined, in the sense that, hey, we're friends, and now we're, boyfriend and girlfriend, or boyfriend and boyfriend, or girlfriend and girlfriend, and now we're married. No, we have now explored degrees of that. So maybe we are together in a non-platonic way, but we don't consider each other's boyfriend or girlfriend, or, maybe we are married, but we're not married in the more traditional way that a lot of people are used to. And that's where I want to explore. So it's almost that, yes, it's possible that these things can be more of a step-by-step process, but I think it's more so that we are just exploring that choice and that preference and sort of seeing if it works for us.
Yeah. Well, then, to mention your experiment, and make this a bit more concrete. What was your experiment like, in maybe a few sentences?
Yeah, I'll try to make it short. So pretty much we were looking at whether or not personality plays a role in people's preferences for short-term or long-term dating. And everything we found was pretty much consistent with pre-existing research for the most part. So like in regards to the similarity effect, in that those who are similar tend to prefer those individuals. So we saw that for sure in the more long-term commitment aspect. But we noticed something with the introverts when it
Well,
came to.
Just to take a step back, what was the task that they had to do, or just
Oh,
explain that part too?
okay, yeah, I can.
I wasn't sure
I don't know
about
how
that.
detailed you want me to get.
Just the experiment, like what was
Yes.
concretely done.
So individuals were given a hypothetical scenario, pretty much giving them the gist of a person. A profile is what we called it, a hypothetical profile. And each profile was, there were, I think, 4 different variations. So one was more of an extrovert who's expressing long-term commitment. One is an extrovert expressing short-term commitment, an introvert long-term, introvert short-term. And we use specific keywords and terminology that was derived from pre-existing research. And so each individual was provided with that prompt, and we assessed that against their own personality and qualities that they possess, and we compare those. And that's how we end up sort of seeing those different dynamics.
How did you determine if they were extroverted or introverted, the participants?
Yeah, so we used the 5-factor model. So we had them sort of do all of that, and we used it on a more of a scale basis.
Okay. And for the hypothetical people, what made the participants recognize them as one or the other, as extroverted, introverted?
So they weren't. So they were only
Okay.
given one. Yeah, they were only given one.
I see.
Yeah. So based off of that, we garnered how much they were into that person, or how much how willing they are to form some sort of bond with them. And, you know, to the credit of the pre-existing research, I think it showed that what we did was in line with all of that. So even when, for example, a person who is an extrovert is confronted with a hypothetical profile of someone who's an introvert with short-term commitment, extroverts continuously, for the most part, show that they're not into that person.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah. What did you discover?
So again, everything was pretty much similar to what we already know, but what was very interesting was that introverts, when it came to short-term commitment, or what we would call short-term dating, we saw that there wasn't much of a difference in their preference. So it showed that they would be into forming some sort of bond with another introvert or an extrovert in that arena. And I think that's what we do. And that's what I sort of unpacked more in my thesis, which is that I think a lot of us explore different types of relationships, even though they may not be as well suited for us as the research outlines. You know, this is why this phrase "opposites attract" continuously resurfaces, even though the research has shown time and time again that opposites do not attract, that the similarness, birds of a feather flock together, that aspect is more of what we see. But what I assert is that that similarity factor is only important if what you want from this relationship is something long-term, is something more substantial. But if you're just interested in this person in a more casual manner, or you're unsure as to what you may want, that those type of things don't necessarily matter, then opposites attract becomes something that's intriguing and novel.
Did you see that with many participants?
We saw that with the introverts. And that also is not surprising, because we know that individuals who are defined as extroverts tend to be more socially desirable. So seeing introverts sort of express that to some degree made sense. It was shocking to sort of see it, you know, in the data itself and be like, wow. You know, I know a couple of people where I presented this at was like, oh, that's very interesting. Like, you should try to explore that again. And we did replicate the data. I haven't gone through it yet, but we did replicate the data, and I'm curious to see if we get the same results or not.
Yeah, that makes me think of, as far as when people do choose partners, in what way do you think that might differ from choosing friendships, or from research, you know, or even from experience?
Yeah, I think that so some people say that sometimes they don't necessarily and I find this interesting. This is why I use the term conscious and unconscious, because some people say they don't necessarily choose their partner, it just sort of happened. And I believe that for the most part, the general public understands those type of sentiments. But I think that Aaron and Aaron have this this model called the self-expansion model. And what that entails is that we form particular bonds with people in order to acquire a quality that they have. So if this person seems to be, you know, very energetic and enthused and always, you know, hyper in this way, and we want to be that way, we may want to associate ourselves with them in the hopes that some of that rubs off on us. So I think that a lot of times we do that on a more grounded level. And when I mean grounded, I mean as an initial interaction. Sometimes we do that, but like, oh, I like that about that person. That's really cool. I'll talk to that person again, or I'll reach out to them again. And I think that's where we start seeing, where did this go? So it can go this friendship route, or it can go this more non-platonic route, and sort of deciding whether we go one way or the other. That's where the extra stuff starts coming in which we're like, okay, well, how badly do I want this quality, you know? Or am I also interested in another aspect of this individual? And that's when it ends up being this sort of like match or mismatch of qualities. And a lot of times people don't know. People don't know if this person was better suited as a friend, or this person was better suited in a more non-platonic way. But research has shown that those individuals who are friends first and then take their relationship in a more non-platonic manner tend to be more enduring.
Or what would you define as enduring in this case?
So enduring would be like high levels of satisfaction, potentially even longevity, so the duration of the relationship, and a lot of similarities in the sense of what they report in regards to how they feel about the relationship.
Okay, all that makes sense. A lot of this sounds relatively intuitive, but it's always important to question your premises and to what extent do you think a lot of relationship research has to do with norms about relationships, like assumptions of, say, the way monogamy should work, or assumptions about marriage or having kids. Do you think assumptions about that affects relationship research, or even today, or are there different directions people have explored maybe in the past 10 years that really diverge maybe from these common sense notions?
Yeah, when you say that, what comes to mind immediately is cohabitation. So the research has shown over and over again that individuals who cohabitate before marriage tend to have a lot more difficulty and are at higher risk of what we will say relationship dissolution, which means that the relationship is broken up in some form. So they're at higher risk of that if they tend to decide to live together prior to being married. But pretty much a lot of people do it. A lot of people do it. And sometimes they say it's because of financial reasons. Sometimes it's a preference. Some people just like to be close with someone, or, it's convenient in some sort of way. And I have been sort of diving deep into those type of readings. Those always interest me because I'm always trying to understand why that is the case. Why do we constantly see that in the research that they're at higher risk? And the research shows that it's because you haven't fully committed to this person. It's almost like you have one foot out of the door still. So when you make this huge declaration, like marriage is supposed to be, then you're all in. And it's harder. It's not impossible, because we know divorce is a thing, but it's harder to walk away from a person when you're married than when you're not married. And that is true. That makes sense to me. But I think what today's society is sort of saying, like, well, what is behind the marriage? Is the fact that we have to have this specific agreement indicative of whether or not we should live together or not? So it's almost in some way that people are sort of doing their own sort of agreement. It's not marriage, but it's some sort of commitment agreement that people are already doing, whether it's intuitive or if it's clear, communicating from partner to partner, in the sense that, hey, like, this is the person I want to be with for this, for an extended period of time. we're going to do our best to make that work. And I think that's what's being pushed back, because we do see that those individuals who are engaged when they're living together tend to still show promise. So it's not necessarily the actual institution of marriage, it's just the agreement that each individual has expressed with each other.
Yes. So, well, it makes me think sometimes that even what a researcher might say is a dissolution of a relationship might be to some not a complete break or loss as much as abnormal or different. I mean, I've heard of people who are much older, like maybe their 60s or above, that have new relationships and even married and don't live together, but they're deeply committed, but not in any way that resembles a normal marriage. You might even say that they're separated or broken up, but by their standards, it works and they're happy and they're fulfilled. So it's hard to say sometimes whether a relationship is always in the terms or paradigms of a researcher, especially since it's norm heavy what defines relationships a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I think that's what makes a relationship psychologist's job difficult, is because people are defining what a relationship is. So it's not completely a one size fits all for everyone. But I think, at least for me, what I try to do is I'm trying to just sort of see what is going on and what seems to be the most common consensus, and sort of bringing that out to people. And I think that's one of the major things. And this is across all different types of sciences, but a lot of times what's in the science is not truly being communicated to the public in a way that they understand. So I also believe that in this aspect of ambivalence, in the sense that people do not necessarily know what they want when it comes to relationships. But I say that if we tell them this, if we explain this to them in a way that they will understand, that maybe the choices that they make or how they decide to engage with each other may change. And I think that's possible. And there's little research, very little research on this, but I think when people are informed about something, they react and behave differently.
Yeah, I think that's true. Any science, actually.
Any science. And I think that's important. And that's why, I kind of call out, and it's so funny, I actually did this at a relationship conference in which I kind of called it out too, because I think this is something that continuously persists, and which is that, we're doing all this research and all this stuff, but we're just sharing it with each other. You know what I mean? Like, the public is not getting this. The public is not understanding this, because we continuously keep seeing certain things over and over again. When will this shift? And, I think a lot of times we forget that because we're so wrapped up in trying to see something and find something. But research only matters if the public understands it.
How would you ideally get things out to the public?
I'm glad you asked that. So I've brainstormed a few ways, and I've also looked up different ways in which other people have done. But one for me is to try to bridge those gaps. So, and that's one of my goals ultimately, is to, in a few years, hopefully, be able to work in a sphere in which I'm able to connect my research directly to the public. And that sort of leans more into those more industry tech jobs and things of that nature, because you tend to see that a little bit more. And then there's also just providing talks. I think that's another thing too. I think a lot of people don't find the value in providing talks in the way that they used to. And I think it's because we have these different mediums that you're able to get information from. But I also think there's something personal about listening to someone who is an expert in a field telling you these different things, and then also providing you with the opportunity to talk with them after they have spoken for you to apply it more to yourself. And this is where, this is why people who are like motivational speakers become so prolific. It's because of that intimate nature of hearing someone and feeling like they're talking to you. But in my case, it would be more, empirical and more, quantitative, that I would be expressing this in a way that they would understand, but also that is completely backed up with evidence.
Yeah. So like how do you imagine that? Like in what form do you imagine that taking?
Yeah, it would just literally be like more of a like public speaking.
Okay.
So, go to different conferences and talk, but not just secular or private conferences, but more public conferences where
Yeah.
anyone is able to go to. Going into different types of media like podcasts and TV shows, and things of that nature, and reaching out to them. And, and I've tried to do that in some different ways, myself as well. But I think for me, when I was doing that already, I wasn't as informed as I am now. So I think as I become more and more closer to this, I guess you could say, idea of an expert, that when I start to speak on these things more so, it becomes more powerful, as like what I'm doing now.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Related to at least making the research more relevant to people or applicable, or in what way do you think you would do research ideally? Like if you had all the funding you needed, how would you research relationships in a way that's accurate and meaningful without getting into technicalities that might not apply to real life?
That's a good question. So for one, I would use a more representative sample. As you know, we tend to use a lot of undergraduates and things of that nature, people of that nature, for our studies. And though they are a convenient sample, they're not as representative as I would like. And I would also like to sort of pick and choose people. And when I say pick and choose, is I don't mean like personally picks. It would still be random, but that they're coming from different aspects. Like if I was able to do a national speed dating event where you have literally one person from each state in the United States of America, and put them on a room together, that would be powerful. You know what I mean? That would be so interesting to sort of see what happens. But it's never been done. It's never been done. It's impossible, almost impossible to get done. And I think because we work with these limitations sometimes, we sometimes get complacent in our findings. But everyone, obviously, because everyone are is scientists, they understand that, this is not, this may not have as much, what we would say, external validity as it should, but it's more common amongst people who are familiar with this type of work. But I would love that. I would love to do some sort of like major national study, or just be a part of it, and I think, some people have done it in the past. It is a challenge, some people have done it in the past. They haven't done exactly what I just stated, but they've done certain things, or they've created different a national database. That's one of the common things that I see, is that you have different it doesn't have to be psychologists necessarily, but different scientists of sorts, or researchers, I should just say, different researchers across the country doing the same study, and then compiling it all together. So that's one way for sure. But I would love if those samples were more mixed up together. That would be more interesting for me.
What do you think about, I guess in general, studies like where more observational in nature, they're just observing people in the wild, so to speak. And do you think those, or what value do you place on those?
I think those are good. And I think if you're able to do it in a way that, again, still has more external validity, that would be interesting. So I would hope that, you would have to sort of look, like I would say, for example, New York is probably a good environment or location to do some sort of observational research, because it's an area where there's a diverse group of people inhabiting the area. So that might be very interesting. But the issue with observational research is that, it's up for a lot of criticism and I guess you could say, I guess the word I'm looking for is questions, because there are so many different things that can sort of be pieced apart, and rightfully so, like, oh, so, this is what you observed, this is what you saw. And yes, we have video and things like that, and people still consider videos as observational in some areas. So even having that there, you could be like, oh, did you get all the angles that you needed? Like, there seems to be something else going on there. And I see this a lot in like facial recognition studies, especially when it comes to expressions of positive feelings and things like that, or expressions of negative feelings. I see that in some research too, at which, people are able to do that, but then a lot of times some people sometimes have an awareness that they're being observed. So there's a lot of things that you can like nitpick into. So for the most part, I don't cling to that area, but I still think that area has value.
Yeah. Are there any, well, you mentioned that the many different, the speed dating example. What about more laboratory stuff? Are there any particular types of interactions that you're especially interested in between romantic partners?
Yeah, for sure. I think so currently I can't speak on it too much, but there's one that I'm about to start working on soon, in which we're looking at sort of initial attraction and trying to manipulate it to some degree. So that would be interesting to do, and sort of having people who not necessarily know each other already, sort of see how they interact with each other. So I think that would be sort of interesting to sort of see. But I'm familiar with quite a bit already, but I'm also dipping my toe in more because I'm working on a project with someone, but interracial dating as well, in which we're sort of seeing what it means for someone of a particular race to engage with someone of a different race. That is not necessarily the same experience depending on your race. So it's hard to generalize in that regard. And I find that very interesting too. So if we were able to, I mean, again, this is not something I don't think is possible, but if we were able to sort of have, I would say, I don't know what the exact term is, but I think it's something like an equal sample or something like that, in which we had the same number of people represented based on their race as part of a particular sample, that would be great to see, just for power reasons. And it would just be great to sort of see that. And because a lot of times people, people who study cultural psychology would tell you that, that what you see, 5 years ago is different than what you'll see 5 years from now. And that's always a challenge because you have to sort of constantly revisit your previous work and update it. So I find that very interesting. And I think it's just because we're still not getting as much of the totality of the individual differences between the different races.
Well, what do you think does show up as a difference between interracial dating and same race? I mean, I can think of maybe in the past parents were not approving, but what about the individuals themselves and their own judgments of what they prefer, what they notice, or what they cling to even?
Yes, I think that's such a good point. I think one of the major ones that's always looked into is stereotypes, which is the stereotypes that people have about themselves as well as others. So that's just one. And then two, this sort of inferiority complex at which if you're part of more of a minority group, sometimes you have this feeling of constantly being minor compared to someone else, or you've been more, I guess the word would be, I don't want to say stigmatized, but I want to say more targeted in regards to that. So you feel that you need to be more careful with what you say and what you do, more mindful of your behavior and how it's perceived with someone of a different race. So there's that type of challenge that constantly sort of comes up here and there. I don't see it too much in the research. I see it more in pop culture. But I think that will be, those are the things I would say reside in individuals. But I think it's very fascinating. It's very fascinating, especially when it comes to, I would say, especially when it comes to young adults. I think that's very interesting.
What do you mean in pop culture about the inferiority thing?
So in the sense that people see certain things. So like if we talk about, even though I would say there's a lot of pushback on it, but when you look at the top magazines and the models and things like that, majority of the time, they look a particular way. And a lot of times people are responding based off of that. So if your partner is telling you you're beautiful and you're just like, no, I'm not beautiful because I just saw all these models there and I'm not like that. So I think a lot of times that can carry weight. And it's not necessarily any one individual's fault there. It's just the way that we sort of respond and I guess you could say digest different types of public material.
Yeah. As far as stress, well, those are stressors. What about some things about interrelational relationships that are even like extra strong and compared to same race relationships, or something that's people find strength in, even however you want to see it?
Yeah, well, there's definitely research on if the person you are engaged with is also, if you're a minority and the person you're engaged with is also minority, then there tends to be some commonality in that. Because what we end up seeing is that when you start comparing different types of research between same race and different race, you see that there's always this collective unification against some sort of other. And it may not be as direct or overt, but that tends to sort of be that tend to sort of be sort of what's pervasive. So, for example, right, the research shows that, and this is controversial, but but the research has shows us that the most undesirable, right, people are Black women and Asian men. And I would tell you that a lot of them do not see themselves that way. And a lot of them have been able to form relationships and long lasting engagement with people of the same race or differ, and even with each other, right? But if you had those two individuals together, you would see that there tends to be this strong camaraderie that they form against society, or how they're supposed to be, or how they're perceived. And I think that's powerful. But I would say that when it comes to the other side of the spectrum, which people would say those who are in, I guess you could say the majority. Again, this is changing though, according to different census, but the majority, which we would say, for example, is white people, then having two white people together, sometimes because they're the majority, they don't think too much of the minority in that way. So when a situation that involves a minority comes to fruition, they don't necessarily know how to handle that, because that's not something that you're constantly dealing with.
Yeah. What are some, curious about other takeaway points you would want to communicate to most people about relationships? Like, if there's, say, two things you want everybody to know that are entering a relationship, what would you tell them?
The first thing I would say is that you do not necessarily know what you want, and that it's okay to explore and see what that can be, and that it is okay for you to change your mind, because you're discovering who you are and who you are in relation to others. So I think that's one of the major advices that I give everyone, because I think it's important to not feel like you're limiting yourself or stifling yourself. Cast a wide net. So that's one major thing.
Let me ask a question about that. Say,
Sure.
casting a wide net. How do you know if, well, you don't want to cast such a wide net that you're almost like ignoring any values you have. Like, I'm thinking of, say, people who are older who haven't had relationships, they might be more willing to just do whatever without regard for what they want, just to make themselves feel. Like, how would such a person or anybody actually decide when they're actually at casting a not too wide? Because if it's too wide, you're just have no standards. But if you have some width to it or some narrowness to it, you have some standards. So it seems like that's a potential conflict there.
So a lot of times, so what I push back on is this idea of standards or deal breakers or things of that nature, because a lot of time that is derived from something else, that's not necessarily something you have discovered or you have I guess you could say tried and kept or tried and assessed. So a lot of times when we say, like, for example, like, I can only be with someone who's my height,
Yeah.
like something like that, then you've now limited your pool. Now you limited your pool. When there is a person who's just maybe a few inches shorter than you, who is maybe your ideal individual. But guess what? You did not give that person an opportunity because they didn't fit this one criteria. And I think, and though height may sound something superficial, I could even go even more serious than that. Religion, for example. You know, I think a lot of times people try to confine within the same religion, which is okay if that's what you want to do. But I think if you're having difficulty in finding someone you would like to be with, limiting yourself in any regard may be contributing to that. So that's why I say about casting a wide net. It's almost like saying, like, do not say no to someone without getting to know them first.
Yeah.
It's important to sort of get a good read on them, because whatever you thought beforehand may not, and most likely will not, be exactly who they are.
What's your second piece of advice?
My second piece of advice is that trust and communication is key. You have to constantly be communicating, and you have to trust that your partner is being transparent with you. And I think this is why we see certain divorces happening down the line, is that at some point the communication stops. At some point it doesn't matter whether or not our partner is telling us the truth. And I think that it sort of like fizzles out. Your relationship starts to fizzles out, or it becomes more mundane and routine. When you have to constantly be engaging with each other in the way that it's almost like you're constantly reigniting the relationship. You know, it's constantly being renewed. And this is why I support people like renewing vows and stuff like that, because it's like you have to sometimes take a step back and reassess this person, like, oh my God, this is the person I want to be with. This is why I want to express this. I may be changing a bit, but I'm going to let this person know those type of changes that I'm experiencing. And let's talk this out and reassess together. So I find that to be very powerful. And I see that in the research as well.
Like reflecting on your relationship, basically. Is that what
Yeah,
you?
exactly. Reflecting on the relationship. I think a lot of people, they get so caught up in the relationship they don't think about it anymore. It's just like, accept it. It's just going to be how it is, you know? And I'm like, no, it's work. You have to constantly be working at it. You just don't go in and that's it. No, it's constant work.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, like every day's different. So that way it's also work. Sometimes it's good to take an external perspective, like take a step back,
Absolutely.
you say, and just look at it and see what it is. Rather than when you're inside something, sometimes you take for granted that you actually enjoy it, that there's something is going somewhere. It's not just static and one stuck to the now, it's going somewhere to the future. That's how I think
Absolutely.
of it.
Absolutely. You're choosing your partner every single day.
Yeah. What got you so into this sort of research? Like as an individual, like why do you care about this subject as much as you do?
I think I care so much is because this is something that we all experience to some degree or not. You know, I think relationships is something that everyone experiences, and I think, you know, the fact that there's still so many unanswered questions and unanswered thoughts and difficulties that people experience, that this should be highly explored. So I'm about that. I am about trying to unpack and discover different things that are happening that we may not necessarily see so easily on the surface. And I think that's important because, again, it affects everyone. I think sometimes in certain areas, and I'm not going to name things just because I want to be respectful of those domains, but I think sometimes we focus so much on one particular thing, or a disorder, or a particular aspect of of the body, or any of those different things that yes, you are furthering along a lot of research and knowledge, and that is definitely needed. But can you really say that it applies to every single person? And I think that is why I found myself in this area, is because I believe it applies to every single body.
How did you get to psychology? Like, yeah, of course you could get into philosophy or anthropology or even creative writing. What got you to psychology in particular? Like, were you interested in it for a long time? Or is there some journey you got to get here from another subject?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in high school, my guidance counselor had gave me my first psychology book, and I really liked it. It was a textbook, and I actually kept looking at it, and I was very interested and fascinated by it. And then in undergrad, I was open to either going to psychology or in a more the law route, or even some sort of combination of both. But I found myself clinging more to psychology. And then in my sophomore year, I met Dr. Matthew Johnson, who is a marriage and family therapist and relationship psychologist researcher. And that's when my interest became more like, this is what I want to do. And I started working with him in his lab. And then I've been working in relationships or doing some sort of relationship work ever since.
Are there other fields you incorporate into your research, or other like
Yeah,
what you
yeah,
what in particular?
that's a good point. That's a good question. So I do. So again, like I was talking about before, when it comes to reaching out to the public, so there's a lot of I would most likely have to be in a more industry domain. So because of that, a lot more technology aspects and more different types of metrics that are mostly used for different things, trying to apply that more into relationships is one of the things I've been working on as well. So every time I'm in some sort of specialized statistic course, or I'm learning something about a particular model, I'm like, well, how can I apply this to relationships? How can I apply this to couples and things like that? So I find that fascinating. And also to other different themes. I worked at NYU Langone for over 2 years, and I was doing things related to cancer research. But I found that the process at which we sort of process samples, we process like biofluid samples. I found that to be very helpful. And I was like, well, how can I apply this there? And then that's when it comes to, looking at different things and aspects of couples, like saliva, for example, is a body fluid. And, we know that when we look at saliva, we can tell a lot about how a person may be feeling.
What do you think about evolutionary psychology in relation to relationship research? I'm highly skeptical of that because you can't study what a caveman did because we have none of them. For example, like we can only just infer, and sometimes I think they're usually assumptions based on standards of today rather than actual investigation of what they were like. So what is your thoughts on it?
I agree with your assessment for sure that, it's a lot of assumptions that we have there. But what I will say is, the one of the things that always makes the most sense to me in regards to relationships, that is common in evolution, and the evolutionary perspective, is obviously, survival of the fittest and things of that nature. So I think, a lot of times that has to deal with reproduction. So finding someone who you're able to mate successfully and who will be able to survive is important. So that means that in some regard, again, some prehistoric, I don't know if that's the correct term, but some sort of, I guess you could say ancient species was sort of being choosy too.
But it seems to me that there couldn't be much influence even as far as what ancestors did, just because of making your own choices. Like, doesn't seem like that would make a necessary relationship with reproduction. Like, sure, reproduction could be seen as a common incentive, but that seems more to come out as interest in sex mostly, or whatever it might be. And cultural values can change what you seek, but either way, it seems like evolutionary psych is that's secondary and doesn't have much influence. That's
But
my
I,
only
I,
thought.
I would say that, so certain, for example, if we think about certain animals, several animals have been around for multiple centuries. So I would say that um, I would say that, and even in them, like sometimes you find that they clung to things or associate themselves with a particular species for comfort. Um, and to me, that's showing that, oh, this felt good. This felt a particular way. This was some sort of um, um, desire that they had in which it felt good that they continued to do that. And we see that sometimes. We see that sometimes with certain what they sort of called I don't know the correct term, but because there's a term that talks about how certain species are in the same family, but there's another term that almost says that certain species are friends, and that whatever that term is in regards to species sort of being friends, that shows me some idea of that, and sometimes that ends up leading um, to some sort of evolutionary advantage for them too, in which you now have another species that sort of um, looks out for you in regard because they associate you with some regard. So it's almost like forming some sort of bond. Again, I don't know too much about this in detail,
Yeah.
but that's just based off of what I do know or and what I've been told.
It sounds reasonable, actually. I haven't really thought about it that way. But yeah, it's like a desirable thing. Like it's a thing of desire in the same way that I guess even eating food has pleasure and that has survival value, but also even value in itself. Like it's nice to eat and humans do that just for fun.
Yeah,
But it's
that's true.
also fulfilling in that we only do it because of that natural need, but it becomes something greater.
Exactly. Exactly.
Where would you want to see yourself go in this research? Like, what do you see yourself becoming? Like in your ideal, well, if you work hard and do everything as you hope and things go well, where do you want to be?
Well, this is ambitious, but I definitely want to be a leader in this field. I think I am definitely have the drive for it, in the sense that there's so much I want to understand and I want to unpack, that I don't think I will ever really get tired of this or bored of this type of work, because again, I just think it's all over. We all experience it. It's every single individual has some sort of interest in this to some degree. So I think I would continuously want to do this, and in being a leader, I want to be able to, um, again, I would hope to be able to have my own. Um, Research facility in some regards that specifically designated to relationships. I know there's a few that are out there, like I know like the Kinsey Institute and things of that nature, who sort of do things like that. I would want something like that too. Hopefully that's in a perfect world. But if not that, I just want to be able to be hopefully producing very groundbreaking and or interesting research that just allows people to sort of open their eyes more and be like, oh wow, this is interesting, and just sort of have everyone talk about it, because I think that's part of it too. When people talk about your research, that is what you need. That is all you need, because again, people only, I think when people are informed about something, they behave and react differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for answering all my questions. I love learning about all this. It's really interesting stuff.
Of course, of course. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. You asked very good questions. It was really good. Thank you.